It was supposed to be a quiet celebration, just the two of us, an anniversary dinner, some candlelight, and a promise that we would continue to build our life together. But then, she did something that would change everything. She invited him. Her lover. The man who had been lurking in the shadows of our relationship, a presence I'd always suspected but had never fully confronted. I should have seen it coming. After all, the signs had been there, the subtle gestures, the late-night texts, the unexplained absences. But when she casually slipped it into conversation, I felt the floor beneath me shift in ways I never anticipated. "I'd love for him to join us," she said, her voice sweet, almost apologetic as she set down the menu. "It'll be a special occasion for all of us." At first, I thought it was some sort of sick joke, a test to see how far she could push me. But as she looked at me, waiting for my response, I realized she was serious. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, betrayed no sign of hesitation. Her casual demeanor suggested that perhaps I was overreacting, imagining things where there was nothing to see. But deep down, I knew the truth. The moment she uttered those words, my entire world tilted on its axis. I couldn't blame her. After all, she'd been clear from the start that she wasn't the traditional type: monogamy, commitment, exclusivity, all those quaint ideals that people cling to like fragile glass bubbles. She had always scoffed at those notions, preferring the freedom to explore, to experience, to live without the heavy constraints of a single, unwavering connection. But me? I had always believed in something different. I had always believed in the strength of two people, bound together by love and loyalty, facing the world as a united front. Our anniversary was meant to be the celebration of that bond. The night we marked another year of being together, reaffirming our love in the way only we knew how. Now, I was staring at the reality of what she had chosen, a reality I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, my voice steady but laced with a tinge of disbelief. But she only smiled, the corners of her lips curving upwards in that familiar way that always made me second-guess myself. It was her calmness, her confidence in the face of my unease, that unnerved me the most. It wasn't just that she was inviting him into our world. It was that she seemed entirely unbothered by the possibility of what that might do to me, to us. "Well, I do," she said simply, as if the matter were already settled. I could feel the tension creeping up my spine, coiling tighter and tighter with each passing second. The air between us grew thick with unspoken words, with the weight of all the things that had been left unsaid in our relationship. I should have stood my ground, told her that I wasn't willing to share her with anyone, least of all a man I knew nothing about. But in that moment, a part of me, a part one was only vaguely aware of, knew that this wasn't just about her or him. It was about me. About how far I was willing to go, how much I could bear before everything shattered beyond repair. What happened next was not something I had planned for, not something I could have anticipated, but it would mark the beginning of a night I would never forget. "I'll make sure he leaves with more than just an awkward silence," I muttered under my breath, my voice barely audible. She caught the words, the tone, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed over her face. But before she could respond, the doorbell rang, and she excused herself to answer it. I stood frozen for a moment, a storm of emotions swirling inside me. I didn't know what I was about to do, but one thing was certain: this dinner would not go the way she expected. It couldn't. Not when the stakes had been raised so high. As she disappeared down the hallway to greet him, I could already feel the tension building within me, knotting my stomach in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. The dinner was no longer just about our anniversary. It was a game, one where the rules had yet to be defined, and the outcome was far from certain. Would I remain the dutiful partner, the man who played along with her whims? Or would I finally stand up and claim what was mine? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was about to find out. The moment he stepped through the door, I could feel the atmosphere shift. It was subtle, a barely perceptible change in the air, but it was there. His presence, while not overtly threatening, had a weight to it, an undeniable force that seemed to press down on the room, bending the space between us. The smile he flashed her when he entered was too practiced, too smooth. It made my skin crawl, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Was it the way he looked at her, as if she were something to be coveted? Or was it the way she responded, the light in her eyes that flickered just a little too brightly? "Hey, you made it." She greeted him with a cheerfulness that felt both forced and sincere, as though she were trying to convince herself just as much as anyone else. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, his voice smooth and rich with an air of confidence that rubbed against my nerves. I watched the exchange in silence, my eyes flicking between them. There was a connection between them, an unspoken history that hung heavy in the air, like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet burned out. And yet, as she led him into the dining room, all I could focus on was the faintest tremor in her hands, the tightness in her posture that betrayed how uneasy she was, no matter how effortless she tried to make it seem. I forced myself to stand and smile. "It's good to meet you," I said, extending a hand to him, my tone polite, though beneath it, there was an edge I couldn't quite hide. He took my hand, his grip firm, his gaze unflinching. His eyes met mine for a moment too long, as if gauging me, measuring me. The tension between us was palpable, thick like the smoke I had imagined earlier. And in that brief exchange, I knew that this dinner wouldn't just be about us, it would be about power, control, and testing boundaries. "Likewise," he replied, his voice a little too smooth for my liking, as if he had said the same thing countless times before. I watched him as he moved to take a seat. He was tall, well-dressed, effortlessly at ease in a way that felt deliberate. Everything about him screamed confidence, but it was the kind of confidence that made my hackles rise. It wasn't just that he was attractive in a way that made him hard to ignore, though he certainly was. It was the way he carried himself, the air of entitlement that seemed to hang around him, as though he was used to getting exactly what he wanted, whenever he wanted it. As she moved to pull out the chair for him, I noticed how she touched his arm, the way she leaned in just a little too close, the intimate gesture that seemed almost too natural for someone who was supposed to be a guest. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to say something, anything, that would break the spell they had spun in their little world. But no words came. Instead, I let the silence linger, and in that silence, I found something much more dangerous than anger, a quiet resolve. "I hope you're hungry," she said, her voice light and casual, though I could hear the undercurrent of something else, something deeper, more uncertain, just beneath the surface. "I'm starving," he said, his tone playful, as though the tension between us didn't even exist. It was as if he was so accustomed to walking into rooms and commanding them that he didn't even need to acknowledge the simmering heat in the air. I could feel her eyes on me then, the weight of her gaze. She was waiting for me to respond, to react, to settle into this new dynamic. She wanted me to prove that I was okay with this, that I could be the mature, understanding partner she thought I was. But how could I? How could I sit across from the man who was slowly but surely taking what was mine, without a word, without a fight? I forced myself to take a seat, my eyes never leaving the two of them as I slid into my chair. The tension between us all grew thicker, a rope pulling tighter with every passing moment. The dinner, once a simple celebration of our relationship, had turned into something else entirely, something that felt like a test of wills. "So, how did you two meet?" I asked, my voice deliberately neutral, trying to inject some sense of normalcy into the situation. She laughed, though it sounded a little too forced. "Oh, it's a long story," she said, her eyes flicking to him for a brief moment, a silent communication passing between them. He grinned, flashing her a look that was loaded with shared memories. "Yeah, a long, complicated one," he agreed, the words coming out like a whisper, but loud enough for me to catch. My fingers tightened around my glass of wine, the cool crystal biting into my palm. I felt the familiar ache of jealousy stir in my chest, a fire I had always kept under control, but now, it was threatening to blaze out of control. He wasn't just some stranger at the table. He was a piece of her history, a chapter one had never been allowed to read. And worse, it was clear that he was still very much a part of her present. I glanced at her, hoping to catch some flicker of emotion that would indicate remorse, regret, anything that would reassure me that this hadn't gone too far. But all I saw was that same calm, that same controlled expression she wore whenever she was hiding something. She had always been good at hiding her true feelings, better than I ever was. But tonight, I was determined not to let her get away with it. "So," I said, setting my glass down slowly, "what's your story, man? How did you two really meet?" I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe an awkward chuckle, maybe a sheepish confession of some one-night stand that had somehow morphed into something more complicated. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied me for a moment. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, it seemed like he was sizing me up, testing me. "We met at a gallery," he said, his voice casual, like he was talking about the weather. "I'm into art, you know. And so is she." He turned to her then, his gaze lingering a little too long on her face before he looked back at me. "Funny how things work out, huh?" I swallowed, trying to ignore the way his words seemed to curl around me like smoke, wrapping tighter and tighter, making it harder to breathe. "Yeah," I said, forcing the words out, trying to keep my voice level. "Funny. Funny, indeed. It wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about this was." The invitation, the casual way she had slipped him into our evening like he belonged there, it was all part of the plan. And I was about to find out exactly how far she was willing to push this. But one thing was certain, if she thought I would just sit here, silently taking it, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I forced myself to take a seat, my eyes never leaving the two of them as I slid into my chair. The tension between us all grew thicker, a rope pulling tighter with every passing moment. The dinner, once a simple celebration of our relationship, had turned into something else entirely, something that felt like a test of wills. "So, how did you two meet?" I asked, my voice deliberately neutral, trying to inject some sense of normalcy into the situation. She laughed, though it sounded a little too forced. "Oh, it's a long story," she said, her eyes flicking to him for a brief moment, a silent communication passing between them. He grinned, flashing her a look that was loaded with shared memories. "Yeah, a long, complicated one," he agreed, the words coming out like a whisper, but loud enough for me to catch. My fingers tightened around my glass of wine, the cool crystal biting into my palm. I felt the familiar ache of jealousy stir in my chest, a fire I had always kept under control, but now, it was threatening to blaze out of control. He wasn't just some stranger at the table. He was a piece of her history, a chapter one had never been allowed to read. And worse, it was clear that he was still very much a part of her present. I glanced at her, hoping to catch some flicker of emotion that would indicate remorse, regret, anything that would reassure me that this hadn't gone too far. But all I saw was that same calm, that same controlled expression she wore whenever she was hiding something. She had always been good at hiding her true feelings, better than I ever was. But tonight, I was determined not to let her get away with it. "So," I said, setting my glass down slowly, "what's your story, man? How did you two really meet?" I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe an awkward chuckle, maybe a sheepish confession of some one-night stand that had somehow morphed into something more complicated. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied me for a moment. He wasn't intimidated. If anything, it seemed like he was sizing me up, testing me. "We met at a gallery," he said, his voice casual, like he was talking about the weather. "I'm into art, you know. And so is she." He turned to her then, his gaze lingering a little too long on her face before he looked back at me. "Funny how things work out, huh?" I swallowed, trying to ignore the way his words seemed to curl around me like smoke, wrapping tighter and tighter, making it harder to breathe. "Yeah," I said, forcing the words out, trying to keep my voice level. "Funny. Funny, indeed. It wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about this was." The invitation, the casual way she had slipped him into our evening like he belonged there, it was all part of the plan. And I was about to find out exactly how far she was willing to push this. But one thing was certain: if she thought I would just sit here, silently taking it, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The appetizers arrived, but the air in the room remained heavy, thick with unspoken tension. It wasn't the clink of glasses or the soft murmur of voices that filled the space, it was the anticipation of something much more sinister, a feeling that something was slowly unraveling beneath the surface. We all pretended to focus on the food, to engage in polite conversation, but each word felt like a battle, a small war being fought in the silence between us. "I love this dish," she said, her voice overly bright as she speared a piece of crab salad, her eyes flicking between me and him, trying to smooth things over, to keep us on the same page. But I wasn't fooled. I wasn't here to pretend, not anymore. The cracks had already started to form, and there was no turning back now. "Yeah, it's amazing," he agreed, his smile wide and seemingly genuine, but I could see through it, could feel the emptiness behind his words, the calculated way he moved, like a man playing a game I hadn't been invited to. I forced a smile, though it felt like the skin on my face had turned stiff. "I'm glad you like it. I thought we could all use a bit of indulgence tonight. It's not every day you get to celebrate a year together, right?" Her eyes darted nervously to me, and then to him, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The words hung in the air, an accusation without needing to be spoken. Of course, she wasn't celebrating a year with just me, she was celebrating a year with him as well. She was still playing both sides of the fence, balancing between the two of us with all the grace of someone who had mastered the art of double-dealing. I felt my grip tighten around my glass, my knuckles white against the crystal. This dinner, this celebration, had turned into something much more than a mere disagreement. It had become a game of manipulation, a high-stakes game where I didn't know the rules, and yet I was already losing. "So," I said, my voice cutting through the conversation like a knife, "how long have you two been close?" I hated how casual the words sounded, as if I was just asking about a hobby or a favorite show. But inside, I was anything but calm. This was my opening, my chance to expose the lie that had been creeping between us all along. She didn't flinch, but I saw her shoulders tighten ever so slightly, a small giveaway. He, on the other hand, was the picture of ease, as though he had been asked about his favorite type of wine, not the illicit nature of his relationship with the woman sitting across from me. "We've been friends for a while," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had long ago mastered the art of deception. His eyes flicked toward her for a moment, a shared moment of understanding, before he returned his focus to me. "But, you know, sometimes friendship can be a little complicated." Complicated. There it was. The word that could have meant anything but instead held within it all the weight of their hidden connection, the thing they had both kept so carefully concealed. It was the kind of complication that didn't belong in a committed relationship. The kind of complication that, once revealed, could shatter everything. I could feel my jaw clenching as I processed his words. Friendship? How long had he been lying to me? To us? How long had they been feeding me the same hollow excuses, pretending that everything was fine, all while they secretly wove their web of lies behind my back? I refused to let my emotions get the best of me, though. Not yet. Not here. If this was going to be a game, then I was going to play it to win. I wasn't going to be the fool in this room. So, how exactly did this complicated friendship evolve? I asked, leaning forward slightly, my tone deliberately casual, though underneath, it was like a slow-burning fuse. She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass as she avoided my gaze. Her silence spoke volumes, each second that passed without her stepping in, without her attempting to defend herself, only made the truth more undeniable. And yet, in the back of my mind, a part of me couldn't shake the fear that I was just being played, that she was letting me dig my own grave without uttering a single word in her defense. He smiled, unbothered by the way I was questioning him. He was used to it, I realized. This wasn't the first time someone had looked at him with suspicion, with distrust. And just like the predator he seemed to be, he reveled in it, playing the part of the charming rogue, always one step ahead of me. It's not a matter of how it evolved, he said smoothly. It's more about understanding what's real and what isn't, don't you think? Sometimes the lines blur, and what you think is one thing turns out to be something entirely different. His words were cryptic, but I knew exactly what he was saying. He was admitting, without admitting, that he and she had crossed lines. That whatever this was, it wasn't just friendship. And yet, he spoke with such ease, as though what they shared was nothing more than a mild inconvenience, something that could be explained away with a couple of well-chosen words. It was infuriating. I could feel the heat rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I couldn't let them see how much this was affecting me. Not yet. This wasn't about me losing control. This was about maintaining power, about making sure I was the one who set the tone for the rest of the evening. So, you're saying it just happened? I pressed, forcing my voice to stay calm, controlled. No decisions, no intentions, just, one day, it was something else? He met my gaze, and for a moment there was a flicker in his eyes, a brief, fleeting moment of something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Regret? For a second, it almost seemed like he was second-guessing his words, like maybe he was starting to realize that he'd said too much. But then, like flipping a switch, he was back to his smooth, confident self. That's right, he said, his voice low and assured, his smile never wavering. Things just evolved. I didn't buy it. No, this was no accident, no simple evolution. There was too much history here, too much effort, too many things unsaid for it to be anything other than deliberate. But I wasn't about to show my hand. Not yet. Well, I'm glad we're all clear on that, I said, my voice tight but polite. Because clarity's important in any relationship. She looked at me then, her eyes wide, caught between her lover and me. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her wine glass, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, the way her body tensed every time I asked a question that got too close to the truth. She wasn't trying to convince me anymore. She was trying to convince herself. And for the first time that night, I realized that this dinner wasn't just about me confronting them, it was about me confronting myself. What was I willing to tolerate? How far was I willing to go before I called this game off? I wasn't sure yet, but I was beginning to understand that I wasn't playing to keep things the same. I was playing to change everything. The conversation drifted, but only in the most superficial of ways, like someone trying to cover up a wound with a band-aid that was far too small for the damage. We talked about the weather, the latest news, a new restaurant in town, anything to avoid the jagged edges of the truth that were now hanging between us like a dark, looming cloud. Every time I glanced at her, she avoided my eyes, guilty, unsure, unable to face the man she had invited into our home, into our life, and into our celebration. And every time I looked at him, I saw the smirk, the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew exactly how much power he wielded. I wasn't stupid. I knew this wasn't some innocent dinner. He wasn't just a friend of hers, nor was this some casual affair with a blurry timeline. No, this was a carefully constructed plan, one in which I was the naive pawn, a character in a game where the rules had already been set long before I had even realized the game was happening. And now, I was caught in the web they'd spun together. And as much as I hated to admit it, I could feel the pull of it, the way it tugged at my mind, urging me to do something, to make a move. To claim what was mine, or risk losing it all. So, I said, setting my fork down with deliberate slowness, the sound of it hitting the plate like a declaration. What's the plan now? Do we continue pretending this is just some casual get-together? Or are we finally going to talk about what's really been going on? Her eyes widened at my words, and for the first time in hours, she looked at me directly. The guilt was undeniable now, etched across her features, no matter how much she tried to mask it. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she hesitated, biting her lip, unsure of how to respond to something so blunt, so unapologetically confrontational. I wasn't giving her an easy out anymore. Not after everything. You invited him here, I continued, my voice cool, controlled, but simmering with a quiet fury. You've been seeing him behind my back for God knows how long, and now you want to pretend everything's normal, that we can just sit here and celebrate like nothing's wrong? The silence stretched out between us like an unbearable weight. I could feel the tension crackling in the air, the heat of our confrontation rising steadily. His eyes were locked on me now, but not with the same nonchalant arrogance he'd worn before. There was something different in the way he looked at me, something almost calculating, like he was waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't invite him to cause trouble, she said finally, her voice weak, but defensive. She reached out to touch my arm, but I jerked away before she could make contact. I thought we could. What? I interrupted, cutting her off before she could finish her sentence. You thought we could have dinner together like a family? Like you've been seeing him behind my back for months, maybe even longer, and that we could just sit here and pretend it wasn't happening? Her face flushed with embarrassment, her eyes flicking toward him for support, but there was none to be found. He simply sat there, leaning back in his chair with that same self-satisfied grin, as if he knew this conversation was inevitable. Like he'd already won whatever game he'd set in motion the moment he'd walked through that door. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, my body aching with the need to do something, anything, to regain control of this situation. But every time I opened my mouth to say something, the words stuck, like I was fighting against a force much larger than myself. She had invited him into our world, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of everything we had built together. I trusted you, I said, my voice lower now, tinged with the hurt that had been simmering beneath my anger. I believed in us. And you've been lying to me this whole time. Her lips trembled, and she looked away. The remorse was there, undeniable. But it didn't matter. The trust had already been broken. The foundation of our relationship had cracked, and no amount of apologies would ever fix it. I never meant to hurt you, she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, I knew they were empty. They were words she had rehearsed, words she had said to him already, words that meant nothing now. I turned to him, locking eyes with him for the first time since he'd walked in. There was a moment of silence between us, a tense, charged pause that felt like the eye of a storm. You knew about this, didn't you? I asked him, my voice steady but sharp. He smiled, a knowing, almost pitying smile that sent a cold chill down my spine. Of course I knew, he said, his tone casual, unbothered. You think she's been seeing me and not telling you? You think I'm some fool who just doesn't notice? I clenched my jaw, feeling a flare of anger rise within me once again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just anger at the situation, it was anger at myself for allowing it to get this far, for not seeing the signs sooner, for being so blind to everything that had been happening right under my nose. This wasn't just a mistake, was it? I said, my voice low and biting now. This wasn't just some accident, some misunderstanding. This was planned. All of it. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine, his confidence unwavering. You're right. It wasn't an accident. But that's how it goes sometimes, man. People get caught up in things. You can't always control who you fall for. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something, break the glass in my hand and let it shatter against the floor. But I didn't. I stayed seated, staring at him, forcing myself to take control of this moment, to use my words as weapons instead of my fists. Because the truth was, he wasn't just some rival I had to confront. He was a part of the betrayal, a manifestation of everything I had ignored, everything I had allowed to happen while I turned a blind eye. You knew exactly what you were doing, I said, each word deliberate, precise. You walked in here, played the charming guest, acted like you belonged. And now I get to sit here and watch as she unravels everything we had. His smile didn't falter. Maybe you should have paid attention sooner. The words stung more than I cared to admit. They weren't just a jab at me, but at everything I had missed, everything I had failed to see. The years of trust one had invested, all of it crashing down in one swift moment, exposed for what it really was. But the more I looked at him, at the smug, self-assured man who had weaved his way into my life, the clearer it became, he wasn't the enemy. Not really. He was just the catalyst. The real enemy, the one I needed to face, was sitting across from me. Her eyes were wide now, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to speak. She knew what was coming. She knew that the final confrontation was no longer between me and him, it was between me and her. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. The time for pretending was over. It was time to finally see the truth for what it was. I loved you, I said, my voice raw, the emotion finally seeping through the cracks I had been holding back. I trusted you. And now, here we are. You've made your choice, and it's not me. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if time had stopped, and the weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the secrets, hung in the balance. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let her take everything from me. Not tonight. Not ever. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. I could feel the tension in my chest, the oppressive weight of everything I had just said, of everything that had been building up for so long. Her eyes, wide and searching, locked onto mine, desperate for some kind of response, some form of acknowledgement. But I wasn't going to give her an easy escape. Not this time. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, the words seemingly caught in her throat. She was trapped. And in that moment, so was I. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. The person I thought I knew, the woman I had shared my life with, my hopes and dreams, was no longer the woman sitting in front of me. She had become a stranger, someone who had taken my trust and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. You don't get to apologize, I said quietly, my voice steady, almost too calm. Not anymore. She flinched at the words, but I wasn't going to stop. You think you can just sweep this under the rug, act like inviting him here is some innocent thing? That everything's going to be okay, that we can all just have a nice little dinner and pretend none of this matters? Her face twisted with something like shame, but there was also a flash of defensiveness in her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, almost too softly for me to hear. I never meant for it to get like this. Her words, hollow as they were, cut into me, but I couldn't let them affect me. I had spent too long forgiving her, too long convincing myself that things weren't as bad as they seemed. But now, there was no denying the truth. No more half-truths. No more lies. I don't know who you are anymore, I said, my voice harder now, like I was trying to build a wall between us, one I couldn't break down. The woman I loved wouldn't do this. She wouldn't betray me like this. She wouldn't invite him here, knowing what this was. Knowing what it meant. I could see her trying to form words, trying to reach out to me, but I wasn't going to let her. Not anymore. Not after everything. I wasn't the one who had caused this rupture. I hadn't been the one to destroy the trust between us. She had done that on her own. You're right, she finally said, her voice quivering with something I couldn't identify. I've done terrible things. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for everything. I shook my head, my chest tight. Sorry isn't enough. Not this time. Not after everything. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the struggle to keep her composure. But I didn't care. She had broken me, and now I was finally seeing her for what she was, someone who had betrayed me, someone who had let another man into our lives, into our shared space, without so much as a second thought. Someone who had sold me out for a thrill, for whatever it was that kept her coming back to him. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It wasn't even about him. It was about her, about the woman who had become a stranger in my life, a woman who was more interested in maintaining a facade than being honest with me. Do you know what it feels like to be lied to every single day? I asked, my voice low and rough with the emotions I had kept bottled up for far too long. Do you know what it feels like to look at someone and think you know them, only to find out they've been hiding something like this from you? Hiding it in plain sight, thinking you wouldn't notice? She shook her head, the tears finally spilling over as she looked down at her hands in her lap. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you. But things just spiraled, and I didn't know how to stop them. You didn't want to stop them, I countered. You didn't care enough to stop them. You let it go on, let it fester, because it was easier than facing the truth. Easier than telling me what was really going on. You thought I wouldn't find out. You thought you could keep the two worlds separate. But I'm not stupid. And I'm not some fool you can walk all over. The anger in my voice was building again, but this time it wasn't directed at him. It wasn't directed at her lover, the man who had invaded my life. It was all directed at her. At the woman I had loved, the woman who had shattered the very foundation of everything we had built. I could feel her withdrawing, pulling into herself like she always did when the confrontation became too much. But this time, I didn't care. This time, I wasn't letting her hide from the truth. You made your choice, I said quietly, almost too softly. And now I have to make mine. The words hit her like a slap. She looked at me, her eyes wide with panic, as though she hadn't expected me to go this far. As though she hadn't realized just how much damage she had done. But there was no going back now. No pretending anymore. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, I continued, the weight of my words sinking in. And I don't know if I want to. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. You've taken something that was mine, that was ours, and you've handed it to him, without a second thought. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The silence between us was deafening, like the air had thickened with all the unsaid things, all the regrets, all the shattered illusions. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if this was the end, or if there was some fragile thread left between us that could still be salvaged. But in that moment, I realized one undeniable truth: nothing would ever be the same. Not after tonight. Her lover, sitting there like an unwelcome guest at his own feast, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer enjoying the spectacle. The power dynamic between the three of us had shifted in an instant. The game had changed. I think it's time for you to leave, I said, my voice unwavering, the decision firm in my chest. You've overstayed your welcome. He didn't even flinch at the words. He simply stood up, as if this was something he had been expecting all along. He gave her a quick glance, as though trying to read her one last time, but she didn't meet his gaze. She was staring at me now, a mixture of regret and something else, something I couldn't quite place, settling in her eyes. I'll go, he said calmly, his voice lacking any real emotion. There was no apology, no sign of remorse for the role he had played. He was a man who had come, taken what he wanted, and now left as though nothing had changed. As he walked toward the door, I heard her voice tremble from behind me. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I thought we could fix it. I thought you'd understand. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't. There was nothing left to understand. Not from her, not from him. I was done pretending that this was something I could salvage. The person I had been, the man who believed in loyalty and trust, had disappeared along with everything that had been broken between us. All that was left was the wreckage. And I wasn't about to let her, either of them, drag me into the ashes of this twisted mess any longer. The door closed behind him, and for the first time that evening, the air in the room seemed to shift. But it wasn't relief. It wasn't freedom. It was the cold realization that some things, once broken, can never be fixed. And this, whatever this was beyond repair. The door clicked shut with finality, and for a long moment, I stood there in the silence, letting the weight of what had just happened wash over me. The room felt empty, colder now without him in it, but somehow, the absence of his smug presence didn't bring the relief I'd expected. Instead, it felt like a void, an echo of the betrayal that had lingered even after he left. I could feel her behind me, her presence unmistakable, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to face her just yet. Not until I had processed everything, until I had come to terms with the fact that the woman I had loved, the woman who had once felt like my soulmate, was gone. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that filled your chest, suffocating you with its weight, the kind of silence that spoke louder than any argument or confrontation ever could. "I never thought it would come to this," she said, her voice breaking the silence, her words trembling like a leaf in the wind. I could hear the tears in her voice, but there was no sympathy left in me to offer. She had used every ounce of goodwill I'd ever given her. She had squandered my trust, my loyalty, and now, all that was left was the hollow echo of what we used to be. I turned slowly, my gaze finding hers, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I looked at her, not the woman I had once adored, but the stranger she had become. "I know," I said quietly, my voice devoid of emotion, flat and distant. "I never thought it would come to this either." She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes searching mine, but I remained unmoving, stone still in my place. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know what to do." I swallowed hard, the weight of those words hitting me like a freight train, but they didn't soften me. Not anymore. They were just words, words that didn't change anything. Words that couldn't undo the damage, couldn't bring back the trust she had shattered. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice gaining strength, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "And this is what you gave me in return? Lies? Betrayal? You thought you could have it both ways? You thought I wouldn't find out?" She flinched, her hands coming up to her chest like a shield, but it was too late for apologies. Too late for explanations. I had heard all the excuses before, and they didn't matter anymore. Not when the truth was so stark, so undeniable. "I never meant to hurt you," she repeated, but this time it didn't even sound like an apology. It was just the desperate repetition of someone trying to convince themselves they weren't as bad as they knew they were. "Maybe you didn't mean to," I said, my voice quiet but piercing, "but you did. And that's what matters. You did it. And I can't just forget that. I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't look at you the same way anymore." The silence that followed my words was deafening. She stood there, her face crumpling, as if the weight of what I was saying finally registered. Her shoulders sagged, the confidence she had once carried so effortlessly now shattered, broken just like everything else between us. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know if we can fix this." I finally moved, taking a step back, my gaze never leaving her. "No. We can't fix this. Not after everything that's happened. It's over." There was no anger in my voice now, no rage. Just the cold finality of acceptance. This was the end. This was where it all stopped. Whatever hope I had clung to, whatever dreams of us that had lingered in the back of my mind, were gone. She had destroyed them. "I still love you," she said, her words barely a whisper, but they still stung. They felt like salt on an open wound, a wound that had already been exposed far too many times. "I never stopped loving you. I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you too," I said, the words bitter in my mouth. "But you can't love someone and do what you did. You can't betray someone and expect them to just forget about it." She nodded, tears falling freely now, her face pale and broken. But it didn't matter. Her tears didn't change anything. She had made her choices, and now, we had to live with the consequences. "Maybe you're right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe I've ruined everything." "You didn't just ruin this," I said, the harshness returning to my voice. "You destroyed it. You destroyed us." And as I said the words, I realized something. Something that had been buried deep inside me, something that had been trying to get out for far too long. I was done. I was finally done. Not just with her, but with everything that had led us here. I had given her my heart, my trust, my faith, and she had broken it all. She had taken it all and tossed it aside without a second thought. And now, I was done letting her have any more of it. She took a slow, shuddering breath, and then, without a word, she turned and walked away. I didn't follow her. I didn't try to stop her. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to fix. As she disappeared into the hallway, I felt a strange, numb emptiness settle in my chest. It was like a part of me had died, but a part of me had also been set free. In the space where her presence had once been, there was now just nothing. A vast, empty nothingness that stretched out before me, waiting for me to figure out how to fill it. I sat down on the couch, my mind still spinning with the events of the evening. My heart ached, but it wasn't just the hurt of betrayal anymore. It was the pain of letting go. The pain of knowing that the person I had once loved, the person I had trusted with everything, was no longer in my life. And that was something I would have to live with, something I would have to rebuild from the ground up. The hours passed in a blur. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat there, alone in the silence of the apartment that used to be our home. A home that no longer felt like it belonged to either of us. The morning light came, but it didn't bring any clarity. It didn't bring any sense of peace. I had no idea what came next. I had no idea what my life would look like now, after everything had fallen apart. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let her, either of them, dictate my future any longer. I wasn't going to let their mistakes define me. I had lost her, but I hadn't lost myself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to rebuild what I had lost. The rest of the world would have to wait. For now, I was focusing on finding me again.